All right. Good morning to all of you, and welcome to the 10 Years Hence series. Many of you I know are regularly enrolled in this, but of course we have some visitors to this series, so to all of you, welcome. Briefly, the 10 Years Hence series explores issues, ideas, and trends likely to affect business and society in important ways over the next decade. The series is sponsored through the generosity of the O'Brien's Leadership Program Endowment, for which we are very grateful. This event is also part of the Notre Dame Forum on Immigration. The reason why I'm standing up here rather than Jim Rourke, I'm Jeff Bergstrom from the College of Business, is because being part of the Notre Dame Forum on Immigration Committee, we've invited George Borjas to join us on this particular issue for this year. Each year the university selects a topic of importance for students, faculty, and the community to engage intellectually together. And beginning with the October 8th Forum last year, speakers and events throughout the year have increased our awareness of the issue of immigration. So it's a tremendous honor for me today to have the opportunity to introduce our guest, George Borjas. George is the Robert Scrivener Professor of Economics and Social Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's also a Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a Fellow of the Econometric Society, and a Fellow of the Society of Labor Economics. He has served as a co-editor, just recently stepping down, of Harvard's Review of Economics and Statistics, and has also served on editorial boards of several other major journals in economics. He's also served in advisory capacities for the Council of Economic Advisors of the Governor of California, the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S., the U.S. National Science Foundation, and the World Bank. He has published over 100 articles in books and scholarly journals, including the most prestigious economic journals such as the American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, and Quarterly Journal of Economics. He has published as author or editor 9 books on labor market and immigration issues, including a 3rd edition textbook, Labor Economics, and recently on immigration, Heaven's Door, Immigration Policy and the American Economy. His work also appears regularly in major magazines and newspapers, including articles in the Atlantic Monthly, the National Review, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Considered one of the leading experts in the world on immigration issues, please help me in welcoming to Notre Dame once again, for a second time, George Borjas.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I want to do today, actually, is to start by telling a little anecdote. And the nice thing about this anecdote is that it's actually true. It actually happened. And it tells a lot about the debate over immigration policy in the U.S. And it goes back a while. It happened in January 1979 when Jimmy Carter was president of the U.S. And Jimmy Carter invited Deng Xiaoping, who was then the vice premier of China, to come to the U.S. for a state visit to the White House. It was the very first time that such a high-level official from the Chinese government had ever come to the U.S. And Jimmy Carter could not wait to get Deng Xiaoping in the Oval Office, because Jimmy Carter wanted to give Deng Xiaoping a long, long speech about human rights in China. And in fact, the meeting took place in the Oval Office, and Jimmy Carter brought with him a briefing book of various human rights issues that Deng Xiaoping, that he wanted to tell Deng Xiaoping about. And eventually they got to the page in the briefing book that dealt with the right of the Chinese people to emigrate China. As most of you know, communist countries for a long time prohibited their citizens from leaving the country. And Jimmy Carter basically told Deng Xiaoping, how can you think that China can join the club of, civilized nations, so-called civilized nations, if you don't give the people that live there the right to move, the right to leave? Deng Xiaoping sat back and thought about it a little bit, finally smiled and said, Mr. President, you're absolutely right. How many Chinese nationals do you want? 10 million? 20 million? 30 million? Now, needless to say, that was the end of the discussion about immigration from China at that meeting. Now, the reason that's a great anecdote is because Deng Xiaoping put his finger on an issue that's really at the core of the immigration debate in the U.S., even though we never quite put it that way. And the issue is, how many people is the U.S. willing to admit? I mean, what is the number that we want to have as the number of immigrants coming into the U.S.? The fact of the matter is, and I'll give a few examples later, the fact of the matter is that many more people want to come to the U.S. than we would ever be thinking of admitting in any given year, so that we have to set up a limit. So just as an example, suppose that Jimmy Carter had actually thought about this for like 5 minutes prior to the meeting with Deng Xiaoping and said to himself, maybe 10 million Chinese nationals would not be a bad number to have over the next 10 years or something. So you could have told Deng Xiaoping, not 10, you said 10, 20, or 30, we'll take 10. Well, Deng Xiaoping could have then come back and said to Jimmy Carter, well, which 10 million do you want, Mr. President? We have 1 billion people to choose from. And that is the other crucial question about immigration that any immigration policy has to answer. There are many more people that want to come to the U.S. than we would ever be willing to admit. So the U.S. will have to set up a system by which it discriminates or it selects a certain few out of the many applicants. Now, when you look at it that way, those are really the two crucial questions about immigration policy. How many people are we willing to admit? And from the many, many who want to come to the U.S., which people are we willing to admit? Note that neither of these two questions is really the questions that are debated in the U.S. today. We tend to debate things that are completely tangential to this, but tend to ignore those two questions. So what I want to do is basically give you a little history of immigration policy in the U.S. until today, just going back a couple of hundred years. Then I'll give you a little bit of economics behind what's been happening in the U.S. lately, and then return at the end to these two questions of what immigration policy should look like, given what we know about economics. In other words, where should we go from here, 10 years hence, I guess, given what we know about immigration, the impact of immigration in the U.S. So I'm going to put it in context first by giving you a historical flavor of what's been happening. And the best way to start is by telling you that the U.S. is not unique in this. I mean, a lot of people tend to think of immigration as a U.S. phenomenon. The fact of the matter is that right now, 3% of the world lives in a country where they were not born. That's about 180 million people. Now, by and large, the U.S. is the largest immigrant-receiving country, but many other countries receive immigrants. And as a percent of the population, the fact of the matter is that the fraction of immigrants in other countries' population is sometimes larger than it is in the U.S. So in the U.S., for example, in the very bottom there, you can see that about 13% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. The number is actually higher in Austria, 15%. It's almost as big in France, 10%. About the same in Sweden and in Germany. In Canada, it's a lot bigger, 19%. So the U.S. is not exceptional by any means. There has been a resurgence of large-scale immigration into the developed countries, into practically all developed countries, over the last 30, 40 years. And the U.S. is just part of that movement. Now, the one thing that differentiates the U.S. from most of these countries is that we have a long history of this. And a way to see the history is by looking at this graph. In this graph, basically what you see there is official data on how many people have been admitted in each decade to the U.S. legally. And that's a crucial word here, okay? Legal admissions to the U.S. by decade since we began to keep records on this number. And we began to keep records on this number in the 1820s. So you can basically see a big rise peaking around 1900, 1910, a big drop, dropping to almost nothing in the Depression, and then rising again. So we're now at a level as high or a little higher than it was in the peak of 1900, 1910. Now, when you go see a Hollywood movie about immigration, you will see a Statue of Liberty, a boat, people looking at the Statue of Liberty and so on, the sort of mythic image of immigration in the U.S. That's basically that first peak. So that's when at the beginning of the 20th century, about 1 million immigrants per year were coming in, about 9 million people in a decade. And that's what we call the Great Migration, really the first Great Migration. As a result of that very big influx, there was a policy shift, which I'll tell you about in a minute, which literally closed the door to a large extent. In addition to that, it was a Great Depression, which made it very unlikely for people to want to come to the U.S. So by the 1930s, a combination of policy shifts and economic conditions reduced immigration to almost nothing. And since then, it's been going up. And right now, we're at the level of almost 10 million people a decade. Roughly speaking, we're admitting 1 million people a year legally into the U.S. Okay? And a good way to think about this is to sort of look at this PowerPoint slide, which summarizes U.S. immigration policy in a way that will make whoever wrote PowerPoint proud. You can go to the library, and there are 1,000-page volumes describing immigration policy in the U.S., right? So clearly, I'm going to reduce it to 4 bullet points, which means there's a lot missing here, and I'm exaggerating and simplifying way too much more than I should. But nevertheless, this basically tells you what the 4 regimes of U.S. immigration policy have been through U.S. history in sort of in summary form. Before 1875, there were no restrictions. If somehow a person could get their body into the U.S., they were a legal immigrant by definition, and there was nothing else to be said. Beginning in 1875, Congress began to impose an ever larger number of restrictions. So, for example, during that period, Congress began to exclude people. Asians were excluded. They were not allowed in the U.S., for example. People who were political radicals. People who were public charges. All these people were excludable. In fact, the list of excludables is very, very long. It would be this long if I wanted to do it in terms of a PowerPoint slide. But little by little, Congress just began to impose a lot of restrictions on who could enter the U.S. legally. In 1924, as a reaction to the first Great Migration, Congress said, this is it. We're going to stop this. And for the very first time, Congress answered the 2 questions it posed at the beginning. How many immigrants and which of the many should be admitted? What Congress did in 1924 was set up for the very first time a numerical limit on how many immigrants would be admitted to the U.S. So I forget what the number was, 125,000 a year or something like that. But in any case, it was a number that was set in stone by law that said only these many immigrants can come in. Now that number was a lot less than had been coming in, which meant there was a lot of excess demand to enter the country. So what Congress did was to say, since we're cutting down on immigration dramatically, we have to come up with a system that of the many, many people who want to come, we're going to select only a certain few, a lucky few. And what Congress did was to create what's called the National Origins Quota System. Okay? What Congress did at the time was to say, look, we're going to cut immigration down numerically, and what we want the new immigrants to be like is to be like the old immigrants. In other words, we're going to grant visas on the basis of national origin. We want the new people who are coming in to basically have the same ethnicity as the people already here. Now, back in the 1920s, 2/3 of the U.S. population was either German or British. That meant that 2/3 of the visas were given to Germany and the UK. And that was the way the question was decided, through national origin. That system was law between 1924 and 1965. In 1965, as part of the civil rights movement, what Congress did was to revisit the issue. Congress correctly said the national origin system discriminates by national origin, and we don't want that. We want to do something else. And they set up a new system, which is called the family preference system. And basically, the system we have in place today is that system they set up back in 1965. So in 1965, Congress increased the limits, allowed more people to come in, removed national origin as the basis for entry, and replaced that with a family preference system. For almost all legal immigrants coming into the U.S., about the only way to enter the U.S. legally is through a family connection with somebody already here. So people here can sponsor the entry of their relatives. And that's basically the underlying idea behind that system. Now, to give you an idea of how the system works, here are the numbers for 4 recent years, 2001, 2004, on how many legal immigrants were admitted in that 4-year period. About 4 million people were admitted, about 1 million a year. Family preference visas accounted for 2.5 million of that. Now, the way the family preference system works is, for example, if you come into the U.S. legally, you're entitled to bring in your spouse. You're entitled to bring in your small children. There's one other thing in the family preference system that's very problematic. And it's really the thing that people dislike the most and which people want to change. And the point is that there's something called the sibling preference. Now, what that means is the following. Suppose you go abroad for a year and you happen to meet somebody you like and you get married to a foreigner. Because you're a U.S. citizen, you are allowed to bring your spouse immediately as part of the family preference system. So he or she can come in. When your spouse becomes a citizen, your spouse is entitled to sponsor the entry of his or her siblings. So at some point in the future, your sisters and brothers-in-law are allowed to enter the U.S. But once your spouse's sibling enters, that means that your spouse's siblings' spouse can enter, which means that your spouse's siblings' spouse's parents can enter, which means your spouse's siblings' spouse's parents' siblings can enter. Somebody actually did a little algebraic calculation of this. By the year 2200, the whole world can enter, because the pyramid just expands forever. Okay? Now, clearly that's not going to happen because we have numerical limits on top of all this. So what's going to happen instead is a long queues of people trying to enter. And I'll show you the queues later. We have very long queues of people trying to enter through this family preference system. Employment-based visas, school visas, we have about 500,000, which isn't a lot, except that it's a small number compared to the total. It's 5 million over 4 years, basically. And not just that, it's actually very misleading. Because among the employment-based visas are not just the skilled people themselves, but the skilled people's spouses and children. They all count in terms of employment-based visas. So the actual number of people who enter due to skills is actually pretty small. Refugees, asylees, decided on the basis of political conditions in any given year. And then something called diversity visas. Diversity visas is a fancy name for a lottery. The U.S., believe it or not, has a lottery for green cards, what we call a permanent residence visa. Every year we raffle out approximately 50,000 visas to people from all over the world. If you want to see it at work, how the lottery works, come November, the Department of Homeland Security will open up a website. And people all over the world can apply through the web to enter the U.S. legally by winning this lottery. And actually, I'm renovating my home right now. My painter is a lottery winner. So there are people out there who've actually entered that way. And anyway, the way it works is you go into the website, you fill out the application, and a couple of months later, 50,000 numbers are called, and those 50,000 people get visas. Now, just to give you an idea of the demand for entering to the U.S., the last lottery held before 9/11 attracted 11 million applicants for 50,000 slots. And that sort of gives you the amount of excess demand there is to enter. That's why we have to have these limits. Because if, in fact, we didn't have limits, the number of people who want to come in greatly exceeds what most people would expect to happen. Okay? Now, on top of all this, I've discussed legal immigration. On top of all this, there's another system out there of illegal immigrants. And right now, and by now I mean the last numbers available, January 2006, there were 11.6 million illegal immigrants in the U.S. Now, you might say, how in the world could anybody know that? Let me tell you how people get that number, and then you can make the decision as to whether the number is realistic or not, and in which way it's biased. The way this number is estimated, and it's estimated every year by the U.S. government now, and they publish it on the website of the DHS, is the following. The immigration bureaucracy in the U.S. does many things very badly. But one thing they do well is that they keep track of how many green cards they actually mailed out every year. So, and that's the first graph I showed you, how many people were admitted legally over the last 2 centuries, right? We have a running record of keeping track of how many green cards have been granted. We can use that record to estimate how many people who with green cards should be alive today. And by that I mean the following. People who had green cards back in 1930 are very unlikely to be alive today. people who got green cards in 1990 at some age will be alive today. And you can basically use a mortality table to estimate how many people with green cards should be alive in the U.S. today. And that's one number we have, how many legal immigrants there are in the U.S. At the same time, we do these surveys. The census goes out and counts everybody they can find. And they make a pretty strong effort every time they go out to try to count everybody they can find. In fact, they go to community services and immigration system programs to try to get illegal immigrants to get counted. So they go out and count. And when they go out and count, they find some number of people who are foreign-born. The number of illegal immigrants is the number they find minus the number they expected to find. In other words, how many people who are foreign-born truly live in the U.S., actually live in the U.S. according to the census, minus how many people with green cards should be there. And as of January 2006, there was almost 12 million people. Now, the one thing about this number is that only a year earlier, it was only 10.5 million people. And in fact, that's generally true. Over the last, in January 2000, it was 8.5 million people. So this number is rising extremely rapidly at an accelerating rate over the last few years. Using the same methodology. There's no change in methodology in any of this, right? It's official government data that they go out and count people in that fashion. And as you can see, it's a large number that's growing very, very fast. Now let's step back a second and say, is this number realistic, and if not, in which way it's biased? Well, there's one big hole in the calculation, which is when the census goes out, it tries to count people, but it can't count everybody. There are people they miss. And if you missed, you wouldn't enter the calculation. So the census has to make an assumption as to how many illegal immigrants they missed. And the assumption that the census makes, whether correctly or not, to lead them to the 11.6 million number, is that when they go out and count people, they miss 10% of the legal immigrants. Now, if you think that they miss more than that, then the number will be proportionally higher. If you think they miss less than that, it'll be a little lower. But more likely than not, 10% seems low. So more likely than not, you should be seen as a lower bound to what the true number of illegals are. And that's basically U.S. immigration right now. We're admitting 1 million people a year legally, 500,000 or more illegally, and that brings us to a record that we've never seen before in U.S. history if you go back to the very first slide. Now, what about economics and all this? Economics and all this, it comes down to this graph. Basically, in this graph, what I've done, and it's easily replicable, no fancy econometrics, nothing, no sleight of hand here, is simply use census data to calculate what the wage gap is between immigrant men and native men at a point in time. So for example, the 1960 census data is available. Literally, when you leave this room today, you can go to a website, Google IPUMS, IPUMS. All these data are freely available on the website. You can download it in 10 minutes and use it to your heart's desire. And what you can do with that data is calculate how much immigrants earned in 1960, how much natives earned in 1960, and look at the percentage wage gap. If you do that in 1960, that will be the vertical axis, which would tell you that in 1960, believe it or not, the typical immigrant was making about 7% more than the typical native person in the U.S. Okay, so, only a short half-century ago, immigrants in the U.S. were doing incredibly well, better on average than the typical native worker. Do the same thing with the 1970 census. It's gone down to almost zero. So the typical immigrant and the typical native were parity. We're basically earning the same amount in the labor market. Go to 1980, you see a decline. 1990, more decline. 2000, a bigger decline. By 2000, the average immigrant in the U.S. is earning 20% less than the average native worker in the U.S. So in a short 40-year period, we've gone from a +7 wage advantage to a -20 wage disadvantage. Okay? Now, why is this important? I would argue that the reason we're having an immigration debate today is because of this graph. Had this graph looked differently, we would be having a very different kind of discussion. It is the fact that for whatever reason, immigrants today tend to not perform as well in the labor market as immigrants earlier, that we're having the kind of debate we're having in terms of the questions that are being addressed in the debate. Okay? And I want to talk about one question in particular for the debate. The one question I want to talk about today, which economists have spent a lot of time on, is that if you see this kind of graph, one thing that will strike you very quickly is the following question. What does that mean? I mean, clearly what this implies is that a lot of the immigrants tend to be disproportionately low skill. Now, that is not to say there are no high-skilled immigrants. There are many, many high-skilled immigrants. But the numbers are such that they tend to be disproportionately towards the bottom end. And that's what's driving this trend. So once you face the trend, one of the crucial questions that comes up is, what's happening to the labor market for low-skilled workers as a result of this trend? And a lot of the debate over immigration policy is precisely about that. What is happening to people already here as we're letting in a very large number of people whose skills tend to be much lower than those of natives? Now, one way to address that question is by removing yourself from the debate. It's actually a very useful thing to do. The question of what immigrants do to the labor market is a very sensitive, very contentious, very politically charged question today. So what I did to find the answer to that question, of what an economist would say about it, is to actually look at what people used to write about this in a different era. Now, a lot of people in this room, I know from the age distribution, have never heard of Paul Samuelson or seen Samuelson's textbook, but if you're my age or older, you went to college, and more likely than not, you would have used Paul Samuelson's textbook in your economics class. Economics 101 or Economics 1, whatever it's called here, would have been the Samuelson textbook. Okay? And what I did was to go to Paul Samuelson's textbook. Paul Samuelson, by the way, is one of the great economists of the 20th century, in fact, of ever. And he had an introductory textbook that was very, very popular, that was used almost everywhere. So what I did was to go to Paul Samuelson's textbook and see what Paul Samuelson would say about immigration in 1964. Now, I chose that date on purpose, okay? 1964 happens to be 1 year before 1965, which happens to be the year where immigration policy changed. So Paul Samuelson is writing this statement from a perspective of policy that has nothing to do with the way things are today. And what Paul Samuelson wrote was the following. Look, after World War I, laws were passed that limited immigration. I discussed those earlier, the national origins quota system. Only a trickle of immigrants have been admitted since, which is true as of 1964. By keeping labor supply down, immigration policy keeps wages high. The law of supply and demand. I mean, this is precisely what an economist would expect to happen when you restrict supply. Put that in reverse and apply it to today. Since 1964 or 65, laws were passed freeing the entry of immigrants. A lot of immigrants have been admitted since. By keeping labor supply high, immigration policy keeps wages low. That will be the implication of theory, taken apart from all the political nonsense that goes with this question of what an economist would predict should have happened. Now, I actually brought a couple of graphs, which I will not go through in the interest of time, but I'll leave this PowerPoint around if people want to look at it. But I just tell you verbally what all this means, okay? Verbally, what this means, and I'll put the puzzle here. Verbally, what this means is the following. If you believe economic theory and the law of supply and demand, you would expect to find that immigration over the last 20, 30, 40 years should have had a negative impact on the people most affected by it. Now, from the graph I showed you earlier, there's been a disproportionately large number of low-skilled immigrants coming in. One would expect to find that the low-skilled labor market would have been affected by that, adversely. A lot of people have spent an awful lot of time looking into this over the last 25 years. Now, and this is basically a summary of findings around 2000. There's been several generations of research on this already. There's still a lot of disagreement. What I want to do is give you a little flavor of what the disagreement is about and how it is that we are where we are today. As of 2000, I'm citing two studies there that looked at the literature, in the late 1990s, and basically said, doesn't seem to be anything there. I mean, the studies we've reviewed don't seem to find much of an impact. If that were true, it's really a major economics puzzle, which is why so many economists work on it. I mean, a lot of economists work in this area not because of the policy content, but because of the methodological issue associated with trying to see if supply and demand works or doesn't work in this very important context. And there's a big puzzle if these studies are right. We know that a lot of immigrants came in. If you take economics here, as everywhere, one of the first things you do in class is supply and demand, and you start shifting curves. A shift in supply should lower the wage, and yet we don't seem to find it. So what can be going on? What's been going on, let me go back to a graph I skipped. What's been going on, it's basically this. One of the things about immigration in the U.S. that is true not just in the U.S., but almost everywhere where immigrants go, is that immigrants, when they enter the host economy, they settle in a very small number of places. In the U.S., for example, most immigrants, like here it's a graph telling you the percent immigrant in 3 parts of the U.S. In California, in what I call the other immigrant states, and in the rest of the country. The fact of the matter is that by 1990, even 40 years after the whole thing began, or 30 years after it all began, you still have very few immigrants outside California and New York and New Jersey and places like that. To put it in a different way, something like 2/3 of the immigrants live in 6 states. California and the 5 states in that footnote. To put it even more strikingly, 40% of immigrants live in 4 cities in the U.S. The point is, there's a lot of geographic clustering of immigrants. That geographic clustering is what motivated people, let me go back to where it was, it's what motivated people to do what I call the spatial correlation approach. A lot of the studies that were in the literature in the late 1990s basically used the following approach. They said to themselves, the economists said to themselves, if the law of supply and demand works the way we think they work, like Samuelson said, one would expect to find that when immigrants go into a city, like take San Diego, for example, where there are many, many immigrants. Immigrants going to San Diego, the wages fall. Immigrants don't go into Pittsburgh. That means the wages shouldn't fall in Pittsburgh. So if one were to compare San Diego and Pittsburgh, adjusting for everything else that we know that differs across these cities, the San Diego wage should be a little lower than in Pittsburgh. It's sort of correlating across space between wages and immigration. Hundreds of studies have done that. And those hundreds of studies that have done that tend to find that that correlation tends to be very weak, which is where this sort of conclusion came from in the late 1990s that immigration had no impact. Okay? So that stylized fact that people still refer to as immigration having little impact on the labor market comes from these comparisons of different cities. Cities with high immigration, cities with low immigration, correlating the data and seeing whether in fact in cities with high immigration, wages are lower than in cities with low immigration, after controlling for the things that could affect wages across cities. There's a major problem with that. Okay, actually 2 major problems with that. 2 major problems with that is, number one, immigrants going to San Diego, and they don't go into some town in Mississippi on purpose. I mean, it wasn't just a random choice that they made overnight. They chose to go into some cities, and they chose to avoid other cities. Now ask yourself the question, which cities would immigrants want to go to, and which cities would immigrants want to avoid? If immigrants are like everybody else, in terms of trying to do the best they can for themselves, then clearly an immigrant would rather go into a city that has a vibrant economy, growing wages, a good labor market, tight labor market, rather than going to a city with a slow economy, low wages, and a lot of unemployment. So what that means basically is that cities that immigrants go to will tend to be high-wage cities. And that tends to build in a positive correlation, completely spurious, that might negate whatever negative impact they might have had on the wage. So it'd be very hard to find a negative impact because of that. On top of that, think of immigrants going to San Diego. And suppose they really do behave the way theory says, which means they're going to San Diego and the wages fall in San Diego. The next question is that the end of the story? And the answer is not really if you think about it. Because what's going to happen in San Diego? A lot of natives are in San Diego. They see their wages go down. Will natives now sit by and idly go, let things happen without reacting? Well, the answer is no. And the fact of the matter is that we've seen a huge outflow of workers from California. What that means basically is that when people leave San Diego, they begin to diffuse the impact of immigration to someplace else. Like, for example, suppose a lot of immigrants going to San Diego know with the wage there. Natives leave and go to Pittsburgh. Well, that's like immigrants going to Pittsburgh too. A little diffusion took place that carries the impact over the whole country. And as a result of that, comparing San Diego and Pittsburgh will be almost uninformative. It will provide very little context as to what the impact of immigration was really about. So what some people are doing now, including myself, is moving the whole analysis in a completely new direction. And the new direction you're moving it to is to say, look, it clearly makes no sense to compare different cities, given that the cities that immigrants choose tend to be high-wage cities, and given that people can respond. So what you want to do is, instead of looking at the city, let's just look at the national economy. What happened to the wage of particular skill groups as a result of immigration over the last 40 years? In other words, what if you were to trace the wage evolution of a particular skill group over the last few decades and see how that correlates with immigration? And that's what this graph does, basically. In this graph, you would define a skill group by age and by education, more or less. So, for example, let's look at the wage of high school dropouts who are around 30 years old. And the question is, what happened to the wage of a high school dropout who's around 30 years old between, say, 80 and 90? And that will be this number on the vertical axis. In other words, the change in a decade for a particular skill group in the wage. And in the horizontal axis, plot, well, how many immigrants came into that group in that decade? And when you do that for all the skill groups you can get in the data by education and age, that's the graph you get. And that graph is clearly not flat. It's not upward sloping. It's downward sloping. And it has a slope. And the slope that it has tells you what is happening to the wage. It's like a demand curve, in other words. It tells you what is happening to the wage as a result of more immigration. Now, let me give you the numbers so you can basically see what that implies. Here there are two sets of numbers, and I'll talk about both separately, but the first column I'll talk about first. Suppose you were to drop immigrants to the labor market and use the data from that graph to calculate what that implies for the wage of specific skill groups. Most of the immigrants who are landing in the U.S. today happen to be high school dropouts. That means the high school dropouts are hurt the most. So as a result of the immigrants who came into the U.S. between 1980 and 2000, the high school dropout wage fell by 8%. Okay? Which is, not a big number, but if you're a high school dropout, just think of what that means. Your wage is around $20,000 a year, $25,000 a year. 8% of that is like almost $2,000. So for a high school dropout, it's not an insignificant loss in wages. In the middle of the skill distribution, high school graduates from college, there are very, very few immigrants who are high school graduates alone or have some college without completing it. So there's really very little impact in the middle of the distribution. At the upper end, you see some impact again, 4%. And the reason for that is that a lot of immigrants are high skilled. So high skilled natives lose a little bit. Now that's the short run. In the way an economist would define a short run is the following. You're going to drop the immigrants off tonight. Let's look at the economy tomorrow morning before anything else changes. Now, clearly that's a very short-run picture of what could happen. Over time, the fact that wages are lower means that there's going to be a lot of adjustment in the economy. Like one major adjustment will be wages are lower, which means that capitalists are making a lot of money and more capital will flow in to take advantage of the high rate of return to capital. So there'll be an adjustment through capital. In the long run, which is the second column, we're going to take the data from the previous graph and run it through a model that says, well, what would happen in the very long run after all the adjustments that take place? Let me rephrase that. After all the adjustments that could take place have in fact taken place. In other words, at the very end of the process, what would we expect? Zero wage change on average. And that's a theoretical result, by the way. And that's nothing to do with the data. That's just the theory tells you that in the constant returns world, immigration should have no impact on average. But it will have a huge distributional impact. The people who are most affected by immigration, namely the high school dropouts, even in the long run, will have 5% lower salaries. People who are not affected by immigration gain. So there's a redistribution. Now, again, 5% is not a huge number, but if you're making $20,000 a year, $25,000 a year, then it's $1,200. So it's, again, in terms of context, there's some redistribution going on. Now, one of the crucial things here to point out is that one of the key lessons from economics about immigration is that it has a redistributive impact. I've only talked about the redistributive impact that it has in terms of the wage and the worker. But it's also clearly redistribution going on to employers. Because in the short run, employers are paying a lot lower wages and getting money as a result of that. It is no coincidence that when you see debates in Congress about having more immigrants, having more guest workers, having more high-tech workers, like this week Bill Gates testified in Congress, these people are not doing it only because they think it's a good thing to do, in terms of a moral value. These people are doing it because they actually have something to gain from it financially. Employers gain substantially from immigration through this reduction of the wage. And that's one of the key lessons of economics, that there's this redistributional impact. Now, let me jump around and conclude with something else that I want to talk about in the future. So, what does all this imply about U.S. immigration policy? Which is one of the crucial questions that people have to address. Okay? Now, you might find my answer shocking, but believe me, it's the only honest answer to that question. And the only honest answer is nothing at all. Okay? The fact of the matter is that none of these numbers imply a single thing about what the country should do. And people who say otherwise are misleading you and lying to you. And the reason is the following. Suppose to go from data or results to what immigration policy should be, you need to have a context of what it is you want immigration policy to accomplish. In other words, what should be the U.S. objective function in deciding social policy? So, to give you an example, suppose I told you that I want the objective function to be I care about the well-being of low-skilled native workers. Suppose that were my objective function. I want immigration policy to protect the well-being of low-skilled American workers. If you believe the stuff I've shown you in terms of the wage impact on the high school dropouts, clearly what we're doing is not a good thing in terms of that choice, in that policy choice, right? Clearly, letting in a lot of high school dropouts is making low-skilled Americans even worse off, and we should stop doing it. So that's one immigration policy that implied by the data. But now take another objective function. Suppose that instead of caring about low-skilled Americans, my objective function is I want to improve the well-being of low-skilled workers all over the world. Very different objective function, right? There are a lot of poor people out there. One can view immigration policy in the U.S. right now as one of the biggest anti-poverty programs in the history of the world. We're giving millions of very low-skilled workers from abroad a chance at the American dream. And I want to do that, say, as a policy choice, as a policy objective. Well, if that's what you want to do as a policy objective, then the fact that some low-skilled Americans have to pay a little bit for that, well, that comes with the territory. So the same data, in other words, the same data, low-skilled Americans are worse off, is consistent both with a policy choice of letting even more unskilled immigrants in or stopping the flow altogether. So for you to say I want to do A or B really means you should say something about what do you care about? Who do you care about? Do you care more about the American workers or do you care more about the foreign workers? Who is it that matters more to you in setting immigration policy? And that's really what people tend to forget when they discuss all these policy choices. They're trying to mask their moral choices of what policy should be behind data. And using the data as sort of a mask so you don't really know what they really want to do with the world. But that's really quite a very mistaken way of looking at the problem. Data by itself has no policy implication. To draw a policy choice from the data, you've got to add a system to it of moral values, basically, that tells you what it is you want the world to look like. And unfortunately in the US, people are not willing to reveal that. So we keep arguing about the data, we keep arguing about all these little details, never focusing on the bigger questions that really are at the core of the debate. Now let me turn to the future. What is immigration policy? Well, returning to the very beginning of the talk, immigration policy is making two decisions. Well, how many immigrants should come in, and which people should come in, of the people who want to apply. It is actually very useful to think of immigration policy as what's usually called a point system. Now, if you want to see a point system at work, what I recommend you do when you leave this room and go back to your dorm or to your house tonight is go into Google, type in Canada immigration. The immigration website for Canada will show up as sort of the main link. Click on that. That will bring you to the Canadian Immigration Office website, which will say, do you want to come to Canada? Act as if you do. In other words, just follow the logic and say, yeah, you want to go to Canada. How do I apply? And they will then give you a test. Okay? And the test they will give you will have, like, I don't know, a number of questions. And the questions are graded, or the answers to the questions are graded. So, for example, they will ask you, how much schooling do you have? And you say college graduate, and they give you, I don't know, 15 points. You say high school graduate, 5 points. You say high school dropout, they say go to the U.S. They will ask you, what do you do for a living? When I first took the test about 15 years ago, there was a long list of occupations that you would go through. And I would say economist, and economist was 1 point out of 20. Okay? Had I said chef, it would be 20 out of 20. Anyway, so they just go through this list of questions. They ask you, do you speak English? Yes. So many points. French, even better. More points still. Neither, very few points. How old are you? If you're over 45, you might as well forget about it. Go to another website. If you're under 45, depending on your age, they'll give you some points. At the end of all this, they will say the computer updates automatically as you answer the questions. And at the end of all this, your score will be, I don't know, 68 points out of 100. And then they will say, and by the way, this month, the passing grade is 70. They actually change the passing grade from day to day, depending on conditions in Canada. That's the point system. Now, every major immigrant receiving country, other than the US, has that system. Australia has it, New Zealand has it, the US has it, Canada has it. The US, believe it or not, for the very first time, as part of the bill that was debated last summer with the Amnesty and the guest worker program, there was a point system based on the Canadian system I just described in there. Sort of snuck in at the very last minute as a way of getting the US to move in this direction. Okay? For a fraction of the visas. Now, the US will never admit to having a point system, but we actually do, even today. Except we have one question. The question is, do you have family in the US? If the answer is yes, you get 100. If the answer is no, you get 0. That's basically a point system. So, the fact of the matter is that you can think of all you want of immigration policy, but in the end, you're going to have to decide which variables are in your formula and what your passing grade is. And that's really the two questions I asked earlier. How many people to admit and which people to admit? You've got to make a rational choice based on some moral value as to what it is you want the country to look like as a result of immigration, who should gain and who should lose. And then the important thing to decide when you do that is the one thing we tend to avoid discussing. I've said this a million times, and I'll say it again. You cannot please everybody. There's no way you can devise an immigration policy that makes every single person better off. So the question becomes, when you decide how to set immigration policy by picking points and putting a grade, which people are you going to favor? Okay, we're going to have limits. There's no question about the fact we're going to have limits. So the question is, which people will be favored? Now, a good way to think about it is the following. Let's divide the world up into three sections. There is us, and by us I mean everybody here right now living in the U.S. I don't mean native-born Americans. I mean everybody here right now with a stake in the U.S. trying to make a decision as to what to do over the next 10 years. That's us. Do we want immigration policy to benefit us? That's one question. The second question is, there are the immigrants. Clearly immigrants gain, right? Otherwise they would never come. If they didn't gain, they would just go right back. How much should their gain count in our decision making? And last but not least, there are people left behind. Should they matter? Should the fact that, for example, a lot of European countries and the U.S. are competing for high-skilled immigrants, thereby draining a lot of poor countries in Africa of all their medical doctors? Should we care about the fact that people left behind have no medical personnel left? Should they matter at all? So basically there's us, there are the immigrants, and there are the people left behind. Any choice of an immigration policy has to attach a weight to these three groups. And even that's actually harder than that, because even within us, there are people who are low skill, high skill. There are people who are employers, people who are workers, and on and on and on, right? So that we have to attach weights to all these various groups. And that's what immigration policy is about. What is the choice of weight we attach to these groups? Now let me finish with the things that are in the debate today. I talked a little bit about the legal immigration system, skill filtering versus the family preference system. By and large, there's a great unspoken consensus, okay, among policymakers that something needs to be done about the family preference system. And the thing they really want to do something about is really the sibling preference. It's not bringing in your spouse or bringing in your children that is a debate. It's whether you should be allowed to bring in your siblings that allows the entry of completely new family unit into the country. So whenever people talk about reforming the family preference system, they really mean repealing the sibling preference. And, that's a major political issue. Because one of the things that immigrants in this country are entitled to once they become a citizen is the sibling preference system. It's an entitlement. And the question is that entitlement something we should be removing at this point or not? The second question that's important that people are talking about today is the amnesty and the guest worker program. Let me talk about the amnesty first. As I mentioned earlier, we have at least 11 or 12 million people illegally in the U.S. right now. As all of you know, a big debate took place in the country over the last couple of years as to whether to grant amnesty to those 12 million people or not. There are many issues, especially at a place like Notre Dame, that come up when people talk about amnesty, which I'll not discuss very much except for one. And the one I want to discuss is an issue of fairness. Okay? Now, as I mentioned earlier, because of the sibling preference, everybody starts qualifying. There are numerical limits. There are long queues associated with the sibling preference. I looked up the dates last month as to what the queues were. As of the end of February 2008, okay? In other words, as of a couple of weeks ago, if you had been, suppose you have been a Filipino immigrant in the U.S. who was in the U.S. on February 15, 1986. And on that day, you filled out an application to sponsor the entry of your Filipino sibling living in the Philippines. Okay, your Filipino sibling is still in the Philippines. That application would have just come up to the top of the queue 2 weeks ago. Okay? A 22-year wait, in other words. If you have been free from most countries on the Philippines, it would have been, you had to apply in 1997 to go up to the queue 2 weeks ago, 11 years ago. So, people talk a lot about bringing, like, illegal immigrants will not come to the top of the queue, and so on and so forth. Which queue are they talking about? The fact of the matter is that there are these 22-year, 11-year queues among many, many queues that exist already. I'm just giving you examples. And, how you treat this issue. How can you justify giving an amnesty to people who broke the law and literally came last year, whereas people who waited legally for 22 years for their turn are still waiting. And people who are waiting 20 years will wait a couple more years. Okay, so it's a major problem that really needs to be thought through before a blanket amnesty is granted. The other crucial thing about amnesty one should think about is that, to the extent that these amnesties tend to become regular, and this is the second one we're going to go through already, we already had one in 1986, it makes a mockery of the whole immigration policy, of legal immigration. I mean, why should anybody who wants to come legally wait when you know that if enough people come illegally, Congress will relent and grant amnesty at some point? So the incentives for more illegal immigration are not reduced by an amnesty. They're only increased by it. Now, some people would say, well, that's where the guest worker program comes in. If we have a guest worker program, somehow we can bring all these people for a couple of years and then send them back. Let me say two things about the guest worker program. Every single person, economist, social scientist, who studied this seriously, and I've never studied it myself, I'm talking from reading literature, who studied this seriously, comes up with one conclusion. There's nothing more permanent than a guest worker. And the fact of the matter is that the same incentives that motivate people to come here for a few years to make some money exist the day you finish the visa. I mean, why would you want to go back to a country that pays you a tenth of what you earn here? I mean, why should you obey the law, especially when illegal immigration is so easy? So there's nothing in the West. It is extremely difficult, if not impossible, especially within the U.S. legal system, to come up with a system that would actually create incentives sufficiently large to motivate people to go back. In some countries, like Singapore, they literally pick them up and put them to the airport. It is very hard to imagine the U.S. doing that kind of thing. So the guest worker program is not precisely something that the U.S. system is really a good match for. Moreover, it ignores the fact that, again, at the German experience, somebody wrote once about it that we wanted workers and we got people instead. And that's a very important thing to remember. The fact of the matter is that importing a person for a few years is not the same thing as importing an automobile or importing a potato. People are different. There are all kinds of responsibilities, entitlements. There's a welfare state associated with all this. So it is not the same thing as just trading goods. Even though people want to see it that way, people are not goods. And therefore, in the U.S. system, guest workers is really something that's it doesn't really fit in with the way we think of ourselves. Last but not least, national security. Okay, my suspicion is that all the stuff I've said until now is more or less not very meaningful in terms of the future direction of policy. What's really going to drive policy is going to be determined by whatever is happening in some cave somewhere in the Middle East right now, somebody plotting something or other that will affect the U.S. in a serious way in a few years from now, will be immigration related, and then all hell will literally break loose in terms of the policy shifts. Things that we don't now see as acceptable could easily become very acceptable 5 years from now, depending on what happens. And that's sort of the big elephant in the room. I mean, all the economic factors, all the social factors that I haven't talked about, people concerned about, really pale in comparison to what would happen if there were a really serious national security event that could be directly linked to immigration. I mean, just think of what would happen to the Mexican border if the next big event were to be related to illegal immigration to the Mexican border. I mean, things that are inconceivable now would all of a sudden be completely wide open for policy debate. So that's where, if one were to ask me what will be 10 years hence, well, it really all depends, not on economics, but it all depends on national security in terms of immigration. Whatever happens there is going to determine immigration policy in the next 10 years. And the reason economics doesn't really affect things all that much is because, look, a lot of people gain from immigration. This to be very blunt about it. The fact of the matter is that even though workers might lose, Even though taxpayers might lose, some people gain, and the people who gain, gain a lot. Employers gain from immigration, don't want to give it up. Employers who have a supply of workers from Mexico that's low wage don't want to give that up. I mean, they're laughing all the way to the bank, and they want to keep that supply going. And the incentives are that in a political system like the one we have, it will be very hard to change that mechanism for a long time. So we need some kind of major event to happen, really, before any kind of economic considerations can play a role. Now, on the other hand, let me just conclude with one more thing. On the other hand, it seems to me that immigration is one of those topics that really can transcend a lot of stuff. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Last summer 2007, we had a major policy debate over illegal immigration, guest workers, amnesty, and so on and so forth, right? Now, the McCain, Kennedy, Bush proposal was a proposal that, if you think about it, almost everybody who matters wanted. The political elite wanted it. The economic elite wanted it. The academic elite wanted it. It is very rare for all these elites to want something and not get it. And that seldom happens in U.S. policymaking. So there's some undercurrent about immigration that might be influencing policy in a way that that's sort of hard to discern right now. But it is very rare for something that so many people want, who matter so much, to fail so miserably, like the amnesty proposal last summer. And so I'll leave it with that question. I mean, I happen to think that we're in a dynamics right now where these things will go on until something else happens. But on the other hand, you never quite know, because if things were going the way normal policy debates usually go, there's no reason why the Bush-McCain-Kennedy bill would not have passed last summer. That should have passed by basically all standards. The people who really cared about it, really wanted to pass it. So let me conclude with that and take questions. Thank you very much.
We've got plenty of time for questions. There will be microphones available on, I think, both aisles, right?
Yes.
There'll be somebody coming over there. I would appreciate, especially that most of you are students in this class, to stay till we finish the questions at about noon so as not to be disruptive. And I'll let George kind of handle and call it. So,
Okay.
Please go ahead. And don't be shy.
You mentioned the Mexican border for as a gateway for potential terrorists. What do you see about the Canadian border and its implications on national
Say it
security?
again. For what?
You mentioned the Mexican border as a potential gateway for a terrorist to come in. What do you see about the Canadian border and its relationship to national security?
You mean with the Mexican worker?
No. The Canadian border.
The Canadian border, okay.
What do you see about the Canadian border's relationship to national security as compared to the Mexican borders?
Okay, I'm not an expert in that, okay, so I really don't quite know the answer to that question. I suspect that if we really wanted to control the border, we could. It'd be expensive, and it might cost billions in order to control both borders. The Mexican border is 2,000 miles long. A big chunk of it of which is not really passable, so it's actually a lot less than that. The Canadian border, on the other hand, is probably pretty wide open. I don't really know enough about that to answer that, to be honest with you. Okay. Yeah.
George, can you tell me a little bit about the European experience? When the EU began the worker migration programs, you could essentially move from Poland to France
Right.
without a passport. You could seek employment. Has the disruption in the economy, or have the pluses, the additions to the economies of those European nations been substantial? And how would you compare them to the experience in North America?
Okay. The honest answer is we don't really know, okay, because the European context, especially the Polish migration, really began just a few years ago. So the data isn't quite up to date in terms of analysis. The anecdotal evidence is that in some countries, the Polish migration has had a pretty big impact, like in the UK and in other places. But the data sort of lags behind that. Now, one problem with studying the European context is that unlike the US, their data is not freely available. Like I just mentioned it before, in the US, you can literally go to the IPOM's website and download all the census data from the beginning of time till now and study it for free. In the European context, people are not given access to the data. So it's extremely difficult to sort of answer the question you have that you posed in terms of, hard fact data right now. My suspicion would be that there have been two phases in the EU expansion, basically. In the first phase, people expected a lot of migration to occur, and it didn't really happen. Like people, when Spain and Portugal in particular joined the EU, people expected a lot of Spaniards and Portuguese to sort of migrate into the main EU, and the numbers were really quite tiny. So the concern was actually lowered as the expansion took place. If from Poland joined, that things began to become a little different, and it's just too recent to know what the impact has been. Now, I would not be surprised if it's sort of very similar to what the North American experience was. I mean, the law of supply and demand should not be a North American artifact only. Now, in the European context, you also have much more controlled labor markets. In other words, the wage might not be able to adjust so much. So it may well be that in the European context, what's going to happen is immigrants come in, and it's really through unemployment that you see the impact, not through the wage. People having a much harder time getting a job. But we don't know in terms of the data yet.
Waiting for another question.
Okay.
Let me ask about because we are in a presidential year, and at the very end, you raised about the McCain-Kennedy act.
Right.
You do two things. One, because you suggested in other times that something that should have maybe passed. What are a little bit some of the specifics about it vis-a-vis our previous policies that may have surfaced in that? And secondly, what are your thoughts? McCain being one of the candidates and Democrats, we know kind of who the candidates are down to about 3 people. Any sense of your characterization or understanding where they stand on some of those policies? Kind of some sense of to inform an audience about them,
Right.
as you see.
I have had nothing to do with any campaign, so let me preface it that way, okay? On purpose. Avoid the whole thing. It's better. Let me start with Hillary Clinton. It is sort of telling that Hillary's decline in the polls and sort of in her status began with an illegal immigration question at a debate. She was asked about Governor Spitzer's proposal to grant former Governor Spitzer's proposal to grant driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, and she sort of stumbled. She didn't quite know, she didn't quite know what to say, okay? So sort of telling that the whole thing that led to where she is today began with an immigration-related question. I mean, she more or less changed her mind like 3 times in the next couple of days through that question. And that's a very explosive issue. The fact of the matter is, again, it's one of these things that if the political elite could have it the way it wanted it, illegal immigrants would have a driver's license. But it's the people's reaction to that that has prevented that from really going into effect in many places. So that's Hillary. Senator Obama was asked a question about immigration and African-American economic status 2 debates ago, I believe, where he basically did not really address the question. He more or less said, there's no reason to believe why the 2 things would be linked. Now, to any economist, no matter what you believe about the numbers, to any economist sort of thinking about this issue for a second, of course the 2 things are linked. I mean, having more supply of low-skilled workers will affect low-skilled workers here already, and many African Americans happen to compete in the labor market. So of course they're linked. So sort of bypassing the question is sort of kicking the football out in a way, right? To try to ignore it, but at some point that's going to come back. Senator McCain is a different issue. He's had a long history of supporting the McCain-Kennedy amnesty kind proposals. And I don't know how, he now claims that he's seen the light and that enforcement should be, a first priority prior to the amnesty itself. In other words, we should control the border prior to the amnesty. But if you look at the way he wants to control the border, in fact, if you look at the way any of these politicians talk about solving the illegal immigration problem, like building a fence or putting more border patrol, you can tell right there they're not really serious. And for two reasons. First of all, a fence is not going to do anything. I mean, it really cannot control the border. And if you really want to control illegal immigration, the best way to control it will be at the employer level. In other words, you have to penalize the employer. You have to tax the employer for committing an illegal act. The minute you really start taxing employers for committing illegal acts, you see reactions. A great example of that is Arizona. Arizona, as of January 1, passed legislation that basically says to employers in Arizona that if you hire illegals, the first time you're caught, your license to have a business in Arizona will be gone for 10 days. But the second time you're caught, your license is removed forever. A lot of people began to leave Arizona as a result of that. A lot of illegal immigrants began to leave Arizona as a result of that. And a lot of employers are very serious at trying to avoid going through that public relations nightmare if they were to get caught. So if you're really serious about illegal, that's a great test to see whether a candidate is serious about illegal immigration or not. If they say, we're not going to control the border by putting a fence, it's not going to work for many reasons. One of which, by the way, is the fact that about 40% of the illegals are not from Mexico. 40% of the illegals are from countries all over the world. And they don't come in through the border. They come in through the airport with a legal visa, and they happen to overstay their visa when the visa expires. How are you going to control those people? By putting more fences, or by more fencing, or by putting in more border patrol on the border. So a good way to judge the seriousness of the candidates is by just saying what they say about how they're going to stop illegal immigration. Not one of them says anything about employer sanctions, which leads me to suspect they're not really serious about it.
Professor, as your topic is 10 years hence, can you say a few words about the generational demographics and its impact on the picture of immigration, since we're not an even distribution of ages in the country, but we have a very large baby boomer population which is in the process of retiring?
Right. Okay, I've never worked in this area, but somebody who's worked a lot on retirement issues has. His name is Larry Kotlikoff, a very well-known economist at BU. And he has a series of papers now trying to estimate or simulate what the U.S. economy will look like on the different scenarios of no immigration, low immigration, high immigration, especially as the baby boomers begin to age and retire and so on, right? I'm summarizing a lot of research in a short soundbite, but more or less my reading of what he finds is that if people believe that immigration, or more immigration, is a solution to the retirement problem that we have in terms of funding, they're looking in the wrong place. It cannot really solve the problem for a couple of reasons. Number one, the way the Social Security system works is that it's a pay-as-you-go system, right? So that means that, yes, you can bring in immigrants, and they'll pay taxes for the current crop of retirees, but at some point you have to worry about the fact that the immigrants themselves will retire. And who's going to pay for them? So if the immigrants were to adopt U.S. fertility rates, at some point we're going to have to say, okay, we have to import a whole bunch of no immigrants to pay for the immigrants who imported already. So it's just delaying the day of reckoning by one generation. That's one reason the thing might not work. The second reason is that the U.S. Social Security system actually favors immigrants in the following way. The median age of migration is 30. That means that half the immigrants come in, in their 40s, 50s, some even come in their 60s. Once you work 10 years, you qualify for benefits in the Social Security system. That means that most immigrants will have put in a lot less time in the labor market when they retire than the typical American will. But if you look at the payoff matrix that Social Security has, the amount of benefits is not really that different for somebody who's worked 10 years versus somebody who's worked 30 years, or for somebody who makes $100,000 versus somebody who makes $25,000. So it's a very egalitarian system in the sense that almost everybody gets more or less the same benefits despite the amount of time they put into it and despite the wage of the original immigrant. And that too tends to create a net loss for the U.S. when it comes to immigration.
I guess, and I'd say my interest is maybe less in the Social Security question than simply replacing the jobs of the workers who will be retiring.
Okay. I don't see the problem with that, okay? The economy adjusts, and the economy adjusts both to more people and to fewer people. I mean, the fact of the matter is there are many ways in which the economy can adjust. There's capital investments one can have. I mean, a great example is, I mentioned that at breakfast this morning, a great example is California and the production of raisins in California. Almost all over the world, whenever anybody produces raisins, it's all machine-made. It's a machine that actually does whatever it is you need to do to produce raisins. California has a huge supply of low-wage labor going into it every day. California is one of the few places in the world where raisins are handmade or hand-produced. So where there are fewer people in that context, we just switch to machines. And that would happen a lot more than people suspect, I expect.
Any more quick questions?
Yeah.
Earlier, you discussed the theoretical implications of wages for legal and illegal immigration for the whole country. Have you looked at the implications of costs of goods and services to the country, or is there an implication?
I haven't, but people have. There are two kinds of goods you want to look at. One is goods that are tradable, in which case it have no implication, right? Because goods that are tradable, the world price determines the price of the good. And many goods are like that. Where immigration can have an impact is on the cost of non-tradable goods, like getting a haircut or mowing your lawn, taking care of your children, things like that. And in some cases, probably non-trivial. The only studies I've seen are in terms of looking at the cost of having a maid or having your lawn mowed or stuff like that. But there's no generalized study looking at all the prices. Okay?
On behalf of Notre Dame, let's once again thank you.
Thank you.